Welcome to History with Herodotus, where the boundaries of time and space converge to reveal the intricate tapestry of human experience. Today, we embark on a journey to explore one of the most pivotal and complex chapters in modern history, the Opium Wars. This series of conflicts, which ravaged the landscape of 19th-century China, was a cauldron of imperialism, economic interests, and cultural clashes that would forever alter the trajectory of global politics. The Middle Kingdom, as it was known, was a bastion of Confucian values, with a strict hierarchical society and a deep-seated suspicion of foreign influence. Meanwhile, European powers, particularly Britain, were expanding their colonial empires, driven by an insatiable hunger for resources, markets, and strategic outposts. In this era of burgeoning globalization, the British East India Company emerged as a dominant force, seeking to exploit China's vast market and natural resources. The company's agents, such as James Flint, began to establish trade relations with Chinese merchants, exchanging Indian cotton, woolens, and other goods for Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain. However, this nascent trade was soon disrupted by the Qing government's strict regulations and restrictions on foreign commerce, which limited European access to Chinese markets. As the 18th century drew to a close, the British East India Company found itself facing a significant trade deficit with China, largely due to the immense popularity of Chinese tea among British consumers. To offset this imbalance, British merchants began to seek alternative commodities that could be exchanged for Chinese goods. It was in this context that opium, cultivated in British-controlled India, emerged as a highly lucrative and sought-after commodity. The British East India Company's monopoly on Indian opium production enabled them to flood the Chinese market with this highly addictive substance, which quickly gained popularity among China's wealthy elite. As opium addiction spread throughout Chinese society, the Qing government, realizing the devastating social and economic consequences of this trade, began to take drastic measures to suppress it. In 1799, the Joqing Emperor issued a decree banning the importation and sale of opium, marking the beginning of a long and tumultuous struggle between China and European powers over the opium trade. As we navigate the complex web of events leading up to the Opium Wars, we find ourselves in the midst of a maelstrom of conflicting interests, cultural misunderstandings, and imperial ambitions. The key players in this drama are taking their positions: the British government, driven by its desire to expand trade and protect its colonial interests; the Qing dynasty, determined to maintain its sovereignty and protect its people from the scourge of opium; and the Chinese merchants and traders, caught in the crossfire between these two behemoths. In the early 19th century, the British government, under the leadership of Lord Palmerston, began to take a more aggressive stance on the opium trade, viewing it as a vital component of its economic strategy in Asia. The appointment of Charles Eliot as Chief Superintendent of Trade in China marked a significant shift in British policy, as Eliot was determined to expand British trade and influence in China, even if it meant challenging Qing authority. As tensions between Britain and China continued to escalate, the Qing government found itself facing internal strife and external pressures. The Taiping Rebellion, a massive civil war that would eventually claim millions of lives, was brewing in southern China, while the British were preparing to launch a series of military campaigns to enforce their trade demands. The fate of China, and indeed the future of global politics, hung in the balance as the world teetered on the brink of a conflict that would be known as the Opium Wars. As the British government's resolve to expand trade and influence in China hardened, the Qing dynasty found itself confronting an increasingly belligerent foreign power. In 1839, the Chinese authorities, determined to suppress the opium trade once and for all, seized a large shipment of opium from British merchants in Canton, sparking a chain reaction of events that would ultimately lead to the outbreak of war. The British government, citing the need to protect its citizens' property and commercial interests, began to mobilize its military assets in the region. On June 28, 1839, a British fleet comprising 16 warships and numerous transport vessels set sail from Singapore bound for China under the command of Admiral George Eliot, the cousin of Charles Eliot. This expeditionary force was tasked with compelling the Qing government to reopen Chinese ports to British trade, including the lucrative opium market. As the British fleet approached the coast of China, the Qing authorities, aware of the impending threat, began to mobilize their own military forces, including the formidable Chinese Navy. The first major engagement of the Opium Wars took place on November 3, 1839, when a British fleet clashed with a Chinese naval force off the coast of Kowloon, near present-day Hong Kong. The British warships, with their superior firepower and maneuverability, quickly gained the upper hand, sinking or capturing several Chinese vessels. This decisive victory allowed the British to establish a foothold on the Chinese mainland, from which they would launch further military campaigns against the Qing dynasty. In January 1840, the British government formally declared war on China, with the objective of forcing the Qing government to sign a treaty that would grant British merchants unfettered access to Chinese markets, including the right to trade in opium. The British military campaign, characterized by its speed and ruthlessness, quickly gained momentum as British forces captured key cities and ports along the Chinese coast, including Canton, Amoy, and Ningpo. One of the most significant events of the Opium Wars occurred on August 29, 1842, when British forces, under the command of General Henry Pottinger, captured the city of Shanghai, a vital commercial center and gateway to the Yangtze River Valley. The fall of Shanghai marked a turning point in the war, as it gave the British control over the Chinese economy's lifeline, allowing them to dictate terms to the Qing government. As the British tightened their grip on China, the Qing authorities, realizing that further resistance was futile, began to negotiate a peace treaty. On August 29, 1842, at the city of Nanjing, Chinese and British diplomats signed the Treaty of Nanjing, which imposed harsh terms on the Qing government, including the cession of Hong Kong to Britain, the opening of 5 Chinese ports to British trade, and the payment of a substantial indemnity to compensate British merchants for their losses. The treaty marked the beginning of a new era in Sino-British relations, one characterized by British dominance and Chinese subjugation. As the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, it marked the beginning of a new era in Sino-British relations, characterized by British dominance and Chinese subjugation. The treaty's provisions, including the cession of Hong Kong to Britain, the opening of 5 Chinese ports to British trade, and the payment of a substantial indemnity, were deeply humiliating for the Qing government. However, the treaty also had far-reaching consequences, as it paved the way for the expansion of European influence in China and the eventual collapse of the Qing dynasty. In the years that followed, the Opium Wars continued to shape the course of Chinese history. The Second Opium War, fought between 1856 and 1860, saw the British and French launch a series of military campaigns against the Qing government, culminating in the signing of the Treaty of Tianjin, which further expanded European influence in China. As the Chinese historian and philosopher Wang Tao noted, the treaties imposed on China by the foreign powers were like a sword hanging over the nation's head, always ready to strike. The Opium Wars also had a profound impact on Chinese society, as the influx of foreign trade and ideas challenged traditional Chinese values and institutions. The Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864, was in part a response to the social and economic upheaval caused by the Opium Wars. As the rebellion's leader, Hong Xiuquan, declared, "The foreigners have come to our land, bringing with them their opium and their guns, and we must rise up to defend our nation and our people." Today, the Opium Wars are remembered as a painful and humiliating chapter in Chinese history, a symbol of the country's weakness and vulnerability in the face of foreign aggression. However, they also serve as a reminder of China's resilience and determination as the country has emerged from the ashes of its past to become a major world power. As the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, once said, "The Opium Wars were a bitter lesson for our nation, but they also taught us the importance of self-reliance and independence." In conclusion, the Opium Wars were a pivotal moment in modern Chinese history, marking the beginning of a century of foreign domination and influence. However, they also laid the groundwork for China's eventual rise as a major world power. as the country learned to navigate the complexities of international relations and to assert its own interests on the global stage. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.